So in this video we're going to be making pizza dough or bread dough. This is made from wheat flour with the assistance of fungi. The fungi is yeast. The dough is going to become a soft and pliable, stretchy, and it's going to be full of small gas bubbles that are produced by the respiration of the yeast. I'm going to be using this dough to make some pizzas, and the amounts and quantities are going to be for that. You can also use the dough for making bread rolls or loaf of bread. We're going to be using wheat flour, which I've got here, and then some salt. We need yeast as well. This is active yeast, but you might also have sure-bake yeast, which has some additives in it that help in raising bread. The active yeast has just got the yeast cells in the form of granules. If you use the sure-bake yeast, you need to use twice as much as if you use the active yeast. Yeast is stored in this dry form in a sealed container. It stores best in the fridge. We're going to take some sugar and use that to set the yeast off, and that's how we're going to start this. I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of sugar and some water. You don't want to use too much water at this point because you have a certain amount of water that the bread is going to need, or the dough is going to need. If you make up too much water with your yeast, then you will exceed the amount of water required for your dough. I'm going to take some of the yeast here. I'm making dough from 600 grams of flour. I'm going to use 2 teaspoons of this active yeast. Going to stir the yeast in and wait for it to dissolve. This is called proving the yeast, which is really just showing that the yeast is alive, checking that the yeast is alive, and that after a few minutes or 5 or 10 minutes, we should be able to see some small bubbles start to form. That's bubbles of gas caused by the respiration of the yeast as they consume the small amount of sugar, and that tells us that the yeast is alive and will start reproducing. Next we're going to need the flour, so I'm going to measure out using these scales the amount of flour I want. This is white wheat flour, and going to use 600 grams of flour for my pizza doughs. So you could use wholemeal flour, you could use standard flour, high-grade flour. Usually for bread you'd use high-grade flour or strong flour because they have a higher gluten quantity. Also good for pizza bases. You can use wholemeal flour, particularly if you use it 50-50 with the white flour. Generally for this we put the dry ingredients all in first. So we've got the flour, and we'll add some salt to it. I'm going to add about 1.5 teaspoons of salt for my 600 grams of flour. The salt's in there basically for flavour. And then before adding our liquid to this, I'm going to mix the salt and flour together. Over behind me here I have a bread maker that I could use for doing this entire process in an automated way, but in this case I prefer to do it by hand as a demonstration of the process and the steps involved, and a chance to talk about what the yeast are doing and what their role is in the making of the bread. Alright, so now I've got the dry ingredients in the bowl and the yeast is dissolved and is now producing little bubbles in here. So I'm ready to start mixing the 2 sets of ingredients together, and I'm just going to do that by pouring this yeast mixture, which has now got a nice yeasty smell, into the bowl, and mixing them up with my fingers. In this case I've got about 250 milliliters of the water with yeast mixed into it. In general, when you're making bread or dough, you're going to use somewhere around 2/3 the amount of water as the amount of flour by weight. So 600 grams of flour, I'm probably going to use somewhere between 300 and 400 grams of water. For pizza dough, it tends to be a little less and than for bread dough, and for white flours it tends to be a little less than for wheat flours. Really what you're going to do is judge all this by consistency once you start kneading the dough. This is one of the advantages of mixing by hand, because you're going to work based on the consistency rather than having to prejudge the amount of water based on a recipe. Okay, starting to mix this up by hand. Gets stuck to your fingers initially, but it will start to come off as the rather wet dough that you get at the start starts to pick up more and more of the flour and become less sticky. What I'm aiming for at this point is for it to be a little bit dry and crumbly, so that when I turn it out on the board it doesn't stick to everything. And then I'm going to add more water to it as I go through the mixing process, until I get something that I think is about the right consistency. Now, obviously in this process the wheat is providing the nutrients for the yeast, it's providing the food. The water that we're mixing in here to make it into a pliable dough is providing the moisture that's necessary for the enzyme processes that go on in the extracellular digestion, the enzyme reactions to occur, and for the mobility of the enzymes and the mobility of the nutrients that are produced by the enzymes, so they can come back to the cells and come back in through the wall of the yeast cells, so that the yeast cells can use those nutrients in its respiration and growth processes. If we use warm water when we dissolve the yeast, and we use warm water when we are making our bread dough, then this has a slight advantage in that it increases the initial rate at which the yeast is going to be able to perform its cellular processes, because the rate of chemical reactions is higher with increasing temperature. But we don't want the water to be too hot, or we could damage the yeast cells. So lukewarm water is good, hot water not so good. Okay, I'm about to start the kneading process using the little bit extra water in the bread dough now to start picking up some of these loose bits of flour and overly dry dough from the board. You can see the kneading process here, where you lift the section of dough, kind of push it down and fold it in a single process using the palm of your hand. You're going to continue this process for probably 10 minutes, and to check from time to time whether it's got the right amount of moisture. You want it to be soft and pliable for the kneading and start to become stretchy, but you don't want it sticky so that it sticks to the board or sticks to your hands. So just on the verge of being sticky is the appropriate consistency. If you accidentally add too much water and it becomes sticky, just to put some more flour on your board and keep kneading, and it will pick up the extra flour it needs, and you keep doing that until it's no longer picking up more flour. Right now I'm using the dough to pick up all of the scraps off the board and clean up the board, as well as kneading it. And so I'm going to keep kneading this for a period of time, which is going to work on the gluten in the flour and start to bring some of those gluten strands, which is like a long stranded protein, into some sort of arrangement that makes the dough stretchy rather than crumbly. Okay, this is after I've been kneading it already for about 5 minutes, and it's starting to be nice and soft and pliable. It's got a reasonable amount of stretch to it. It still tears at a certain point, but it's getting good. It needs a bit more kneading yet. Alright, so I've been kneading this dough now for another few minutes, and it's starting to be really nice and soft. It's just got a really nice consistency to it now. While this is while I'm working this dough, the energy I'm putting into it by continuously deforming it is gently heating it up and helping the yeast with its processes by increasing the rate of chemical reactions. And at the same time, the yeast is going to work in here as well, and it's creating a little bit more moisture as one of the products of its respiration. So it's going to produce the gas bubbles, but it's also going to produce water as one of its byproducts and excrete that back out into the dough, so that over time the dough will actually get slightly softer and slightly stickier if we continue this process. And you'll see that after you've allowed the dough to rise, which is where you're really just letting the yeast sit there and go about its processes. In that period of time, the dough will become much damper and softer. It's one of the reasons you want to start with the dough being reasonably firm at this point. Alright, with some more kneading for a few more minutes, the dough's now reached a good point. I think it's now ready to set it aside to rise for a while. So I've got this bowl here. I'm going to put some olive oil in the bowl and take my lump of pizza dough and pop it in the bowl here, spin it around to get the oil all covering it so it won't stick to the surfaces of the bowl, and then I'm going to put that aside covered to rise for several hours, and I've just covered it with a plate there. If the sun comes out, I'll probably put it in the sun for a bit more warmth. If you've got a warm spot like a hot water cupboard, you could put it in a hot water cupboard to warm up. Somewhere nice and warm in your house, maybe on top of the fridge is another warm spot. And you can see the dough here in the bottom of the bowl, and I'm hoping that after a couple of hours it will have risen to be maybe twice to 3 times the size that it started out. Alright, here we are later in the day, and I've got the pizza dough risen. It's about 2 or 3 times the original size. I'm just going to chop it into 6 pieces for my 6 different pizza bases, where I can then stretch them out in whichever way I want.